Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: supplemental funding request for aid to Israel and Ukraine could come this week. Trump-backed candidate wins Louisiana governor's race. Dozens of countries scramble to identify more than 150 citizens held hostage in Gaza. U.S. officials signal pressure on Israel to address Gaza crisis. Republican chaos hampers U.S. effort to send more aid to Israel and Ukraine. Supplemental funding request for aid to Israel and Ukraine could come this week. Yahoo! U.S. President Joe Biden will submit a request to Congress this week for additional funding to support Ukraine and Israel, according to administration officials. The package will be designed to offer both countries humanitarian and military assistance, although the exact amounts needed have not been released. Speaking about the funding, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said he expected intensive engagement with Congress this very week, as we work on such a package and seek to secure bipartisan support for it. Trump-backed candidate wins Louisiana governor's race. Washington Post. Louisiana Attorney General Jeff Landry, a Republican with strong ties to former President Donald Trump, won his state's gubernatorial race on Saturday night, a major victory for the GOP in a southern state that has been run by Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards for the last 8 years. Dozens of countries scramble to identify more than 150 citizens held hostage in Gaza. Wall Street Journal. World leaders and intelligence agencies are working to determine the identities and conditions of more than 150 people from around 30 countries who have been held captive in a tunnel network under the Gaza Strip by Hamas militants. The U.S. and its allies are asking Qatar, which has contacts inside Hamas, for assistance in cross-referencing names and conditions. Governments have also made appeals to Turkey and Egypt. The number of hostages and the countries involved are still in dispute, with many believed to have dual nationalities, including Israeli. Iran-backed Islamic Jihad has also claimed to have taken 30 hostages, although this has not been confirmed by Israel. Efforts to identify the hostages and negotiate their release have been hampered by the chaos of the situation and the difficulty of accessing the hostage takers, who are hiding underground. The hostages are being held in different locations by Hamas, with some taken by Islamic Jihad. Hamas leaders based in Qatar have not disclosed how many hostages are in their custody, but have offered to trade them for Palestinian fighters held by Israel and the U.S. The hostage crisis is described as having unprecedented global dimensions, and is one of the largest takings of U.S. hostages since the First Gulf War. U.S. officials signal pressure on Israel to address Gaza crisis. Washington Post. The Biden administration has said it is trying to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of an expected Israeli ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, during an appearance on CNN's State of the Union, said people in Gaza deserved access to water and medicine and food. And we are working actively to ensure that happens, he said. Israel had agreed to turn on the water pipe, he said, but only to southern Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry said Sunday that 8 days of Israeli strikes in Gaza had killed 2,670 people and wounded 9,600. Meanwhile, a siege has prevented food, fuel, electricity, and water from getting to the enclave's more than 2 million residents. As Secretary of State Antony Blinken touched down in Egypt on Sunday, relief supplies sat at an airport in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, less than an hour's drive from the border with Gaza. Some of the aid supplies, delivered by regional countries such as Turkey, as well as the United Nations, have been stranded on Egypt's side of the border for days. Republican chaos hampers U.S. effort to send more aid to Israel and Ukraine. Financial Times. The failure of Republicans to select a new Speaker of the House is complicating the White House's efforts to secure funding for additional military aid to Israel and Ukraine. Republicans and Democrats are divided on the issue, and the House of Representatives has been without a Speaker for nearly 2 weeks. The White House has considered providing additional funding for Taiwan and border security to sweeten the deal for conservative House Republicans, but no package can be considered until a new leader is elected. The Republicans have failed several times to coalesce around a new leader, and as many as 55 House Republicans remain opposed to the latest nominee, making his election virtually impossible. Israeli ground offensive in Gaza could be a bloodbath, analysts say. Washington Post. Israeli soldiers will face a difficult task in a ground offensive in Gaza, according to U.S. officials and analysts. They will have to navigate a complex area of tightly packed buildings, mines and tunnels whilst hunting Hamas militants that blend in with civilians. This situation could lead to large numbers of civilian casualties, and may draw other countries into the conflict. The operation is expected to be Israel's most significant in years, and is against Hamas, the Gaza-based militant group responsible for a massacre in Israel, in which over 1,300 people were killed and up to 150 kidnapped. Palestinian officials have said that more than 2,600 people have already been killed in Gaza since the fighting began. Israel has urged civilians to evacuate Gaza City, however, the UN has said that this will be impossible for many. The IDF is likely to launch a coordinated attack by land, air and sea, and is expected to attempt to punch into Gaza from the east, limiting Hamas's ability to move fighters and weapons. Israel's recent rhetoric has raised the possibility of mass killing in the ground offensive. Blinken meets resistance in courtship of Egypt and Saudi Arabia on Gaza war. Washington Post. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been met with resistance from the leaders of Egypt and Saudi Arabia during his visit to the Middle East. Blinken traveled to the region with the aim of convincing Arab states to condemn Hamas and avoid stoking unrest in response to Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip. However, both Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman raised concerns about Israel's conduct during the conflict. Sisi accused Israel of collective punishment and blamed it for Palestinian desperation, while Mohammed called for a halt to the current escalation. More than 600,000 Gazans flee, Israel readies for two-front war. The Sydney Morning Herald. Israel's chief military spokesman, Admiral Daniel Hagari, has said that Israel is prepared to fight a war on multiple fronts, and accused the Iranian-backed Hezbollah of launching attacks on the Lebanon border in order to hinder Israel's offensive in Gaza. Israeli forces, supported by an increasing number of U.S. warships in the region, have positioned themselves along Gaza's border and are preparing for a campaign by air, land and sea to dismantle Hamas. The UN has warned that Gaza's hospitals will run out of fuel for emergency generators within 2 days, putting thousands of lives at risk. The war between Israel and Hamas is testing the Republican Party's isolationist shift. The Globe and Mail. Republican Party presidential hopefuls are offering conflicting messages on foreign policy challenges as the 2024 election campaign shifts its focus abroad. This shift is testing the Republican Party's move toward an isolationist foreign policy and threatens to undermine its broader argument that President Joe Biden has mismanaged U.S. relationships with the rest of the world. Foreign policy questions dominated discussions at recent Republican primary campaign events in New Hampshire, with voters looking for better answers. Republican voters are realizing that the party has shifted over the past 2 decades, moving sharply away from its long-standing support for a muscular foreign policy. This shift has created divisions within the party, with Nikki Haley, a former ambassador to the United Nations, representing the Republican Party's old guard, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy favoring a more cautious, America First approach. Former President Donald Trump has confused the issue with inconsistent messages. Voters are increasingly looking for a strong leader who can navigate the complex and dangerous world and restore the U.S.'s position as a global power. Egypt's leader criticizes Israel's Gaza operation as the top U.S. diplomat extends his Mideast mission. The Toronto Star. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi criticized Israel's military operation in Gaza, calling it a collective punishment, and stating that it had exceeded the right of self-defense, during a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Cairo on Sunday. Blinken's visit to the region comes as the Biden administration attempts to prevent the war with Hamas from escalating into a broader regional conflict. Blinken, who is meeting with leaders throughout the Arab world, plans to return to Israel on Monday. Ahead of his visit, he reaffirmed Washington's support for Israel, stating that the U.S. would stand with Israel today, tomorrow, and every day, but emphasizing that Israel must take every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians. Blinken also stressed the need for Israel to affirm shared values for human life and human dignity. During his visit to the Middle East, Blinken has met with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. In conservative media, Biden is to blame in the Hamas-Israel war. New York Times. Conservative media is blaming President Biden for the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Critics argue that American intelligence was responsible for the Hamas attack, and that the Biden administration's loosening of financial sanctions allowed Iran to give money to Hamas. Some conservatives have linked the outbreak of violence to a broader critique of the left and liberal policies, suggesting that agents of Hamas could be slipping into the U.S. via the border. Conflict in Middle East could escalate, U.S. officials warn. Reuters. Top U.S. officials have warned that the conflict between Israel and Hamas could escalate into a wider conflict across the Middle East. They expressed concern that the Lebanese group Hezbollah could attack Israel's north or that Iran might get involved. The U.S. is also trying to ensure that Palestinians trapped in the Gaza Strip have access to food, water, and shelter as Israeli forces prepare for a ground assault. Officials are working to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and are discussing a new weapons package for Israel and Ukraine. U.S. expanding military presence near Israel. New York Times. The Pentagon is rapidly doubling the amount of U.S. military power deployed in the Middle East in an effort to deter a wider regional war, and to carry out possible airstrikes to defend American interests. Defense Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III said in a statement on Saturday night that he had ordered a second aircraft carrier, the Dwight D. Eisenhower, to the eastern Mediterranean to join the carrier Gerald R. Ford to deter hostile actions against Israel or any efforts toward widening this war. The Air Force is also rushing additional land-based attack planes to the Persian Gulf region, doubling the number of F-16, A-10 and F-15E squadrons on the ground. Number of American hostages held in Gaza is unknown, John Kirby says. The Independent. The White House has said that it is unsure how many Americans are currently trapped in Gaza, and how many may be hostages of Hamas. The U.S. State Department had previously told Americans in Gaza that a deal had been secured allowing them to pass through Gaza's border with Egypt, but this deal never materialized. Americans were left waiting by the border, with some reportedly taken hostage by Hamas fighters. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said that the U.S. is actively trying to locate and return Americans trapped in Gaza, but the operations cannot be discussed publicly. He also stated that there are no plans to deploy U.S. troops to the conflict between Israel and Gaza at this time. Israel vows to destroy Hamas. What happens to Gaza at the war's end? Washington Post. The uneasy coexistence that Israel and Hamas have had over the past 17 years is unlikely to survive the current conflict, according to experts. The shape of the Israel-Gaza relationship will depend on what is left of Hamas and Gaza when the fighting ends. Already, Israeli air attacks have killed over 2,300 people and decimated public infrastructure. Possible scenarios include Israel reoccupying Gaza, at least temporarily, or the return of the Palestinian Authority to the enclave. Israeli officials are not yet discussing the possibilities. Meanwhile, Israel's stated objective is to eliminate Hamas once and for all. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, is gathering tanks and troops for a ground operation, with the operational goal of defeating Hamas and eliminating all senior officials involved. A scenario in which the political wing of Hamas survives to govern the enclave is highly unlikely but not impossible. The vacuum that would follow a deposed Hamas would need to be filled by a governing body that could rebuild the devastated enclave while preventing Hamas from regenerating itself. Joe Biden, Democrats report raising more than $71 million for his 2024 presidential run. The Globe and Mail. President Joe Biden and the Democratic National Committee raised more than $71 million for his re-election in the 3 months ending September 30, a strong indication that party donors remain united behind him going into a 2024 race that may feature a rematch with Donald Trump. Biden to push Israel, Ukraine aid package over $2 billion this week. Reuters. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has confirmed that the new weapons package for Israel and Ukraine will be significantly higher than $2 billion. The package is currently being considered by President Joe Biden, who will have intensive talks with Congress this week to secure its approval. The process has been delayed due to the Republicans' struggle to pick a speaker for the House of Representatives. Sullivan also stated that the package will include the necessary military equipment to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as help Israel fight its terrorist threat. Top U.S. envoy will return to Israel after stops in Arab nations aimed at avoiding a broader conflict. The Toronto Star. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit Israel for the second time in 5 days to consult with Israeli officials, the U.S. State Department has announced. The visit follows a series of talks with Arab leaders, including the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority, and a meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh. Concerns about a wider conflict have grown as Israel plans a military action against Hamas. CNN poll: Americans deeply sympathetic toward Israelis and see their military response to Hamas attacks as justified. CNN. A new CNN poll conducted by SSRS found that the American public expresses deep sympathy for the Israeli people and broadly sees the Israeli government's military response to Hamas attacks as justified. The poll also revealed that 2/3 of Americans are at least somewhat worried that the fighting between Israel and Hamas could lead to terrorism in the U.S. There are divisions by party and age in how Americans view the conflict and the U.S. response to it. The poll also found that President Joe Biden has slightly more confidence from the American public in making the right decisions on the conflict compared to the war in Ukraine. China to benefit as U.S. gets bogged down in the wars of its allies. SCMP opinion. The recent high-level engagement between the U.S. and China has helped to stabilize their relations, according to top U.S. envoy to China Nicholas Burns. President Xi Jinping unexpectedly met with U.S. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer in Beijing, and it is expected that she will meet with U.S. President Joe Biden at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit next month. The mainstream U.S. media has also toned down its criticism of China. However, the U.S. government and foreign policy establishment have institutionalized hostilities towards China through the establishment of committees and task forces focused on China. Ladies and gentlemen, it's me, Dr. Six, your friendly neighborhood observer from the sixth dimension. As always, I'm here to bring you the latest news from around the world and provide you with some witty analysis. So let's dive right into it. First up, we have news that U.S. President Joe Biden is planning to request additional funding for Ukraine and Israel. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't help but think that Ukraine and Israel must be feeling a bit like the popular kids in school right now. Everyone wants to be their friend and give them money. Maybe they should start charging for autographs. Moving on, we have the Louisiana governor's race, where a Trump-backed candidate emerged victorious. It seems like Trump's influence within the Republican Party is still going strong. It's like he's the Beyoncé of politics, everything he touches turns to gold. In other news, we have the ongoing hostage crisis in Gaza. It's a truly chaotic situation, with world leaders scrambling to identify and negotiate the release of over 150 hostages. It's like a real-life game of hide and seek, except the stakes are much higher. Let's hope they can find a peaceful resolution soon, and bring those hostages back home. Next up, we have the Biden administration's efforts to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. They're trying to ensure that the people of Gaza have access to basic necessities like water and medicine. It's like they're playing the role of the neighborhood superhero, swooping in to save the day. But let's hope they can do more than just turn on the water pipe to southern Gaza. I mean, come on, everyone deserves a hot shower. Now, let's talk about the Republican Party's struggle to select a new Speaker of the House. It's like watching a really bad reality TV show. I can almost hear the dramatic music playing in the background as they try to find someone to lead the pack. Maybe they should bring in a celebrity host, like Ryan Seacrest. He's good at bringing people together, right? And finally, we have the escalating conflict between Israel and Hamas. It's a tense situation, with analysts warning that a ground offensive could lead to a bloodbath. It's like a real-life action movie, except there's no popcorn and the consequences are all too real. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail, and they can find a way to end the violence. Well, that's all the news I have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed my witty analysis and found it informative. Now, it's your turn to join the discussion. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any burning questions for me? I'm all ears. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.